So this is my grandpa, Arnold Van Den Berg, and he is an awesome person. He's a yogi, and he started Century Management. And for those of y'all who came last time, my dad works there, so it's our family financial business. So he has an incredible story to share with y'all today, and hopefully y'all can all learn a lot from him. So, Papa.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you all for coming here tonight. It's a pleasure to meet with people and share some of the things that happened during the Second World War. One of the things that you learn when you go through a Holocaust, is my family went through, there's a lot of lessons that you can learn, life lessons that literally change your life. And so while I want to tell the story about what happened in Holland to the Jewish people, I also want to emphasize on the wonderful lessons that can be learned from that. Lessons that literally, in many ways, you could never learn any other way. One of my favorite philosophers, James Allen, said, we either learn by wisdom and knowledge and suffering and woe, and we continue to suffer until we learn. So suffering is one of the greatest ways in which we learn lessons about wisdom. And so this is where our family started. This is our home in Amsterdam, Holland. How many of you know the story of Anne Frank? Okay, well, if you move the next slide, you can see we lived right down the street from Anne Frank. That's our house at the bottom there, the Van Den Berg house. And Anne Frank's house was just up the street. Our number was 823 Prinsengracht. That was a very famous street in Holland, and she lived on 267. So it was about a mile and a half away. One of the interesting things about Anne Frank's house is they turned it into a museum. And my daughter went to visit Holland a few years ago, and she happened to go through the Anne Frank Museum, and she was shocked to find our names in there. And the people's names in the Anne Frank Museum were all the people who were sent to Auschwitz, the concentration camp, where my parents were sent. And they assumed that we had all died in Auschwitz. But my folks both went to Auschwitz, but they both survived. And I was fortunate to survive as well. And the reason that I survived is because when you took the Jewish people from Holland, they sent them to Auschwitz. And Auschwitz was a death camp. They had many camps. There was like 30 or 33 camps. But this camp, the whole purpose of going there was just to wait your turn to die. And they had the gas chambers going full time. They could gas 10,000 people a day. And so my folks were sent there. Now, when Anne Frank's parents were caught, Anne was caught with her parents. So when you get to Auschwitz, the first thing they do is they gas the women and the children. There's no women that goes there and survives with children. So if I would have gone there with my mother, I obviously wouldn't have survived. So my dad took a very big gamble. I was about 2.5 years old. My brother was about 5 years old. And he arranged with the Dutch underground, and they arranged with a 19-year-old girl to smuggle my brother and I through the German lines. Now that was a very risky operation because they checked passports at every place you went. And we had some passports, but they were fake. And it wasn't too difficult to be able to tell that they weren't the real passports. So what they did is they put one guy in front of us. So she was sitting with us here. There was another guy in front. So when the SS officer would come on the train and he would check the passport, he would keep him busy. He would ask him instructions and how do you get to this place and keep him busy. And the lady that hid me or took me said to me after I spoke with her after the war, she says her heart was beating so hard it was just like it was going to pop out of her chest because she was so worried that they were going to check her passport. But anyway, the whistle blew and she was so relieved, and so the officer had to get off the train. and they never did check our passports, so we were able to get to the orphanage. And I was in the orphanage from about 2.5 to 6 until my parents were liberated from Auschwitz and came and picked me up. So the first lesson and the first principle that I want to discuss with you tonight is the principle of what would make a 19-year-old girl who didn't even know us risk her life to save a couple of kids. That's a pretty amazing thing for a 19-year-old girl to do. But the most important thing that was even deeper than that, what could possess her father to send her on a mission like that? I mean, how many people would send their daughters on almost a suicide mission to save a couple of kids they didn't even know? So I struggled with that for many years. And when I was about 26, 27, I went through a severe depression, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And I asked my psychiatrist, I couldn't figure it out. I said, what could possibly make some young woman do that for me or anybody else? And he said, oh, that's very simple. I said, really? He says, yes. He says, it's a matter of principle. If your life is worth more important than your principles, then you're going to sacrifice your life. If your principles are more important than your life, you sacrifice your life. So that's one of the things that I learned from that. It's very important to have a philosophy in life, because unless you have a certain principles or philosophy, you could never take these kind of risks for other people. You would never go out on the limb like that, because if your own life was that much more important, you'd sacrifice your principles. If your principles are more important than your life, you sacrifice your life. These people were deep Christians, and they were willing to sacrifice their life for their principles. So that was one of the first lessons that really struck me, that I thought was profound. And I made that a very important part of my life, to think about that the thing that makes people take these kind of risks for other people is because they have a principle that is even more important than their life. The second thing that I thought was an amazing story is that my mom and dad were put in what they call Westerbrook. That's a holding tank where all the Jews were collected. And they met a couple of people they became very friendly with. And so they put them on this train to Auschwitz. And that was the beginning of a horrible story, because on this train, it was during the winter, it was cold, it was 3 days going from Holland to Poland. There were literally no bathroom facilities on the train. Everybody was packed in the same thing. They had a little bucket in the corner where everybody had to go to the bathroom. And there was no food, no water, no bathroom facilities. That was the first 3 days on the way to Auschwitz. Anyway, when they got to Auschwitz, they immediately separated people in 2 lines. And the first line was that if you were old, if you were a woman with children, or if you were sick, or you couldn't work, you would go on to the one side. All of those people would go to the gas chamber the first night. If you were strong, if you were healthy, if you looked like you were younger, then you would go to the right side, and then you would go into the barracks and you would go to work. Now, as you well imagine, what's happened in the gas chambers is they made the people feel like they were going to take a shower. So they had everybody go into this big room, and they had them undress, put their clothes there, and say, be sure you remember where your clothes were, because after the shower, you come up and get your belongings. And then they crammed everybody into this big room, which had shower heads, and then out of the shower heads came the gas. And so after about 15, 20 minutes of suffocating with the gas, everybody was dead. Then they took them out of the gas chambers and put them in the crematorium. So anyway, this friend of my mom's was on the train with her, and she got there, and she was a young girl, and she had had a fight with her mother. And so they weren't talking on the train. So when they got there, her father went up to her and said, Beppy, I have a very bad feeling about this place. I really think that you ought to apologize to your mother. So she thought about it, and she says, you know, Dad, you're right. So she went up, they hugged and kissed, and they made up, and she never saw her mother again. She went to the other side. And that night in the barracks, they had all these barracks where people were sleeping there. And she said she couldn't sleep. She just kept thinking. So she went outside, walked outside the barrack, and there was a woman standing, leaning against the wall. And she was looking around, and she saw this big chimney. And out of this chimney was just nothing but black smoke. And she was thinking, geez, I wonder what that is. So she went up and asked the lady, well, what is that chimney there? And she said, let me ask you a couple of questions before I tell you that. She says, did you come here with your children? She says, no, I don't have any children. She says, thank God. She says, did you come here with your parents? And she says, yes. She says, how old are they? So she told them. She says, I'm afraid to tell you this, but when people of a certain age get here, and especially if they have children, they go into the gas chamber, and that's the crematorium. And I am sure that with your parents, that's probably where they are right now. And she says that was just the most amazing thing that she just couldn't even comprehend it. Can you imagine out of a normal society being in a place when all of a sudden they just take people's lives without thinking about it? And it was just a very, very troubling period for her. But she says the greatest lesson for her, and that's what I want to leave with you, is that you never let arguments get in the way of making up with your loved ones. Because just think if she hadn't made up with her mother. The lesson is there, she made up with her mother, and at least her mother went to her grave knowing that she was on good terms with her daughter, and she didn't have to live the rest of her life feeling guilty that she didn't make up with her mother. So that's one of the lessons that I learned from this, is that whenever you have a quarrel with the loved ones, you make up right away, because you never know. And it isn't, you don't have to be in a concentration camp. Somebody could have a heart attack, there could be an accident, there could be a stroke, there could be any number of things. I gave a speech to a group of middle school who were studying Anne Frank, and I got a letter from one of the girls, and she said, I want to thank you for bringing that subject up, because I had a fight with my little brother. But I went home and we made up, and we went to a football game that night, and there was a large stadium, and he fell off. It was almost 20 feet. He fell almost right on his head. And she said she was thinking about it all the time in the hospital, how she was so happy that she was able to make up before this terrible incident. Fortunately, I do believe he's going to make it, but you just never know about these kind of things. Anyway, I don't want to dwell too much on the hardships, but the most important thing that you learn from these kind of experiences and talking to my parents is you learn the tremendous power that we all have within us, the power of the mind, and I call it the power of the subconscious mind. And I'm going to give you guys a couple of thoughts on this, and I want you to think about this, because you have no idea of the power that we all have within ourselves. And it's only when it gets tested at the level that you get tested in these environments that you really see what comes out of that. And just to give you an example, my dad was on a death march. Now, here's what you want to think about. I'm 5'8", about 155, 160 pounds, and my dad was just 1 inch smaller than me, and by the time he was there for 6 months, he was almost 85 pounds. So he weighed almost half of what I'm weighing today. He was very weak, and everybody was at that level. And he said there was an interesting thing that he observed. There were a lot of young kids that came into the camp, young, strong guys from Poland and Russia and different places. And he says they'd be working along, and they'd be working with a shovel, and he would be struggling to lift something up, and these guys had just, he said they were just so used to working hard, they were very strong kids. But he says after a while, when everybody got down to skin and bones, the young people seemed to die off much quicker than the older people. And he got to thinking about it, and he got to talking to people and talking to these young kids. And what you realize is that there's a point where the suffering becomes so intense that unless you have something to live for that is greater than yourself, you just give up and let go. And at that point, if you just wanted to die, you just lay down that day and you could die. You were just kept alive by a will to live. You had no physical strength. It was all mental. And so what he learned is that these young people who weren't married, who didn't have wives, who didn't have kids, they didn't have things to live for like some of the older people did. And I'm going to give you one good example of that later. But the most important thing is that you had to have something beyond yourself to want to live and survive and go through these situations. And just to show you how difficult it was, the cold was, the level of cold in Poland is so severe it's below zero. You had just regular clothes. You'd have to get up at 4:30, 5 o'clock. You'd have to stand in what they call a pel, which is a tension where they take roll calls, and you'd be there for an hour, hour and a half. If you didn't have any shoes, you would just stand barefooted in the snow. You had to stand at attention, and it was a long process. Then you got a piece of bread, which is about this big and about 2 slices bread thick. That was your daily bread, and then you'd get a little watered-down soup in the afternoon or the evening. A lot of times you wouldn't even get that, but that was the normal portion. Then you had to work for 12 hours a day, and in my dad's case, he had to work on an airfield, and the ground was so hard that when you hit it with the shovel, it was just like trying to chop into cement. You know, the ground was so frozen, it would just bounce back, and then if you didn't dig hard enough, they'd come and beat you. And sometimes they'd just knock you down, they would hit you so hard. So it was a very, very difficult life, and many people died, got sick, and were gassed, and so on and so forth. But one of the things that I want to talk about is the power of the mind. And to give you an illustration of that, my dad was on a death march. They had to go to a camp. It was 60 kilometers. It's about 20 miles. They got up early in the morning. They got a piece of bread, and they started marching. There was no breaks, no more food, no more water, and the snow was halfway up to your knees. So the snow was about up to here. You had to march, and if you fell down or you struggled or you caved in, they'd shoot you. So you had to march straight on without any breaks until you got to the camp. He says they started with a whole field of people and just a small group made it. And so what is the thing that could make a person survive that kind of situation when you're freezing, you're cold, you're hungry? And so he said what he had to do is he had to totally focus his mind on just moving his leg. And he said he would lock his knee, and then you had to lock your knee to make your next step, because if you didn't have your knee locked, you would be so tired, you would just fall under the ground. You couldn't get up, you'd be shot. So it was the most important thing that you learn about the focus of your mind. And once you focus your mind on something, you can do extraordinary things. He said you couldn't think about how cold you were. You couldn't think about how angry you were. You couldn't think about how thirsty you were. You couldn't think about how tired you were. You couldn't think about how far you had to go, because any one of those things would have just weakened you. The only thing you had to do was think about moving that leg, and moving one leg at a time. And if that's what you can do, and if you continued on, then you were able to get through it. And that is the power of the mind. And if you will take in your life and focus your energies to that degree, then nothing is impossible. And I want to give you one quote here by one of the great psychologists of all time. The subconscious mind contains not only all the knowledge that is gathered during the life cycle of the individual, but then in addition it contains all the wisdom of past ages, that by drawing upon its wisdom and power, the individual may possess any good thing of life, from health, happiness, riches, and success. And I would encourage all of you to study the subconscious mind, because by drawing upon that principle, you have the ability to do extraordinary things. I've used it in my life to overcome my physical disability. I became a champion gymnast by using the principles. I used it to build a business. I used it to build my life. And by drawing on those principles, you can get through an awful lot of difficulties that you may never get through any other way. I would also encourage you to study hypnosis. I use self-hypnosis and hypnosis on my family for many different things, and that is a great field in which you can find a lot out about yourself, about your past. And if you've ever had any particular problems with anything, by going into the subconscious mind, you can find out what those problems are and correct them, as I've done in my life. And it's a wonderful principle, and if you ever get into a situation where you have that kind of situation, then I would encourage you to do it. The other lesson that I learned from the Holocaust, and what probably the second most important lesson, is that we all have things in our life that cause us pain. People hurt our feeling, people disappoint us, people let us down, people say unkind things to us, and we build up resentment. And one of the most important things that you have to learn is you have to learn to forgive. Because if you don't learn to forgive and you hold those problems within you, you will create for yourself problems that you could not even imagine. Let me have the next chart. And this is a chart that I had made from a psychologist who studied all these principles. But here's the most important thing. You don't have to go through a concentration camp to build up anger, to build up resentment. Because everybody suffers these kind of things through their life. Maybe you have a parent that doesn't quite understand you, doesn't know how to talk to you. Maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a boyfriend, a girlfriend, and so forth. But the most important thing about handling anger is you have to express it in a positive way. In other words, if somebody hurts your feelings, don't hold it inside. Try to sit down, talk with them, discuss it with them. So what my problem was, I developed a lot of anger for many reasons, what I went through. And that created a lot of problems for me. I became a very angry young guy, got in a lot of trouble, got into a lot of fights. That's the kind of thing that leads to that kind of thinking. And I finally got to a point where I became so depressed in my life that by 3:30 in the afternoon I couldn't even move. I'd have to take a nap. And I learned that by studying hypnosis, you can go into a nap in about 20 or 30 minutes, the equivalent to 2 or 3 hours of sleep. And so I started using self-hypnosis to get through it. But while I was dealing with the problem, it doesn't solve the problem. And so when I went to the psychiatrist, he explained that the reason I was so depressed is because when you're depressed, you create anger. And when that gets into your subconscious mind, and you develop that anger, then the subconscious mind has to punish you. And one of the ways the subconscious mind punishes you is by making you depressed. Now, if you take a look at this chart here, it shows that if you have anger and you express it, you general well-being. But if you repress it, it goes inside of you, then it creates more anger, and then it gets into depression, alcoholism, addictions,